Thank you for being here. And a special thank to Maska, my Slovenian publisher, and particularly to Amelia Kreger, because she knows why. I mean, so I am supposed to present this book, Comunitarians and Senior Capital. This book is the transcription of a seminar that I made 2 years ago, in the year 2014, June, and here in Ljubljana, in the Museum of Modern Art, with an audience of friends who have been listening to me with patience for 2 days or 3 days, I don't even remember. Anyway, it was a seminar, a serious seminar, like sometimes it happens to do, and it was, for me, it was an attempt to summarize 50 years of my personal story. Yes, I'm elder than I look. I know I look young, but it's not that true. So I tried in that seminar and in this book to recount the history of 50 years of social movements from December 2, 1964 to 2014. I am not an historian, and this is not an historical book, so I don't recount the history. I don't know. Recounting the history of 50 years of the movements would not require this small booklet. It would require an entire library. So I try to find, if I can say, the meaning or my personal meaning from the history of the social movements, and the meaning that I find in a very personal and, if you want, unilateral way, the meaning that I find in the history of the movements is that the real background of so many adventures of students, workers, women, activists, artists, the general meaning is the autonomy of knowledge from the domination of capital, of financial capitalism, and of capitalism in general. The autonomy of knowledge. Obviously, this is an easy key of interpretation of what happened in the year 68. And I start from 64, because 64, and I start from the main square of the campus of Berkeley, California, because on a certain day of the year 64, a young student called Mario Savio, an Italo-American, said words that I quote, obviously, in my book, said some words that for me are the inmost significance and the inmost intention of the 50 years that followed. He said, when you remember 64, the main problem for the American students was the war in Vietnam, was the danger of being drafted, of being taken and sent to the jungles of Vietnam to kill and possibly be killed. So Mario Savio says, when I understand that my knowledge is used to produce weapons and to kill innocent people in the world, I feel so sick at heart that I wish to take my own body and I want to throw my body inside the machine in order to block the machine. This is, in my opinion, a really anticipating vision. In these words of Mario Savio, I see obviously an anticipation of what happens 4 years after all over the world. The rebellion of students, teachers, researchers against the domination of capital and particularly of the military complex. But not only the year 68 is marked by the consciousness of a conflict, of a contradiction, of an opposition between the infinite possibility of knowledge and the very limited finalities of profit and competition. Not only that year is marked by this conflict. In my opinion, the conflict between autonomy of knowledge and capitalist domination has marked the deep consciousness of the workers' movement in the 60s and in the 70s, when the workers fought against exploitation. They essentially said, in a conscious or unconscious way, they essentially said the richness of knowledge, the richness of technology makes possible a reduction of our exploitation, makes possible a transformation of the process of production in a direction in which we can be free from the obligation of salaried labor, from the obligation of 8 years and more of exploitation every day. Well, this consciousness or this intuition, in my opinion, is the thread that explains 50 years of social conflicts in the world. 2 years ago, in October 2014, after my seminar, Larry Page, who is someone who knows about knowledge and capital, being the CEO of Google, Larry Page, in an interview published in the magazine Computer World of October 2014, said, "I don't understand how the governments of the world are trying to counter the unemployment and are trying to implement programs of full employment and are trying to oblige people to work 8 hours per day, 5 days a week, all their life long." I don't understand how it's possible, because if we, Google, put our discoveries and researches and artificial intelligence tools into the process of production, 50% of the existing jobs will be cancelled overnight. Wow, interesting thing. But you know, the governments of the world and the population of the world and a majority of people, of workers, think that this is a danger. They think, oh, technology is destroying my job. Technology is destroying my salary, my survival. Obviously they think so, because the entire history of modernity and also the history of our days is based on a superstition, the superstition of salaried labor. Sometimes I wonder why Michel Foucault, who has been probably the most important thinker who enlightens the roots, the origins of the modern civilization, I wonder why Foucault did not write a book on salaried labor, on salary, on this concept, which is not only a concept, is also a trap, is also a superstition, is also, in a sense, a chain. Why did he not write a book about that? Then I have a second thought, and I understand that Foucault has only written books about salaried labor. He speaks of the prison, he speaks of the school, he speaks of many things, many institutions, but at the end he is trying to describe a process which is the biopolitical process of subjection, submission of our life to the domination of the salaried labor. But I try to be more explicit, more direct on this point in this book. I try to denounce or reveal the superstition of salary at the core of the present catastrophe. One may say, what is the relation between the superstition of salary and the spreading fascism that is little by little conquering and destroying our world? That is my crucial question. What is the relation? The relation is totally clear. The relation is totally clear if you look at what is motivating the workers of the United States of America, or the workers of the United Kingdom, of Poland, of Austria, and tomorrow of France, to vote for the followers of Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Well, the only explanation of this is that they are frightened by misery, by unemployment, by the possible destruction of their lives and of the lives of their families. So it's clear. The craziness of this superstition is destroying, has already destroyed democracy, and is going to destroy the legacy of our civilization. In a sense, this book is not only an attempt to retrace the history of 50 years of struggles for the autonomy of knowledge and against the domination of salary. It is not only this, it is also, in a sense, a message in the bottle. Do you remember the No, you don't remember the Police because you are too young, but I remember Sting singing a message in the bottle, and he was referring to something that gives me the possibility of saying, let's face reality. Let's face the reality of what is happening now. This book is out of fashion. This book is a recount of the past. This book has to be forgotten because we have lost. We not only have lost the fight for freedom, democracy, but we have lost any possibility of hope. That is the point in which my generation draws a line and recognizes a final defeat. If we look at what is happening now, you see, you think that the history has no fantasy in a sense. We are witnessing something, in Technicolor, no more in the white and black of the 20s and of the 30s. We are witnessing the coming back of the old story that happened in Germany at the end of the 20s, at the beginning of the 30s. What Adolf Hitler said to the workers of Germany, humiliated, defeated, impoverished by the financial capitalism. He said, you are not workers, defeated, humiliated and impoverished. You are Germans. You are white people. You are warriors and you will win. They did not win, but they destroyed Europe. Now, something is coming back, repeating that story, and this time they probably will not win, but they are going to destroy the world. What Donald Trump said to the white workers of the United States of America, he said, you are not workers impoverished, humiliated by Wall Street and its servants like Hillary Clinton. You are not workers. You are white warriors. That is the deep meaning of what the fascists who are seizing power in Europe, in Russia, and in the United States are telling to the workers of the world, particularly to the white workers of the world. I would never have thought in the past that one day in my life I would have been obliged to say those two horrible words, white race. I am obliged to do that, not because this is a concept. White race are two words that mean nothing from the scientific, conceptual, philosophical, religious, moral point of view. I am obliged to say those horrible words because these words are a mythology incredibly powerful in this moment. Some weeks ago, I happened to read an article of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Probably someone remember who Brzezinski is. He is not an anarchist. He is not a communist. He was the Secretary of State of the American President Jimmy Carter some decades ago, and he still is a very smart analyzer of the political reality of the world. In an article published by the National Interest, which is not an anarchist magazine or something like that, is one of the most authoritative papers, not so authoritative in fact, but well, it's part of the establishment and a little bit right-wing. In the National Interest, not interesting at all, Brzezinski publishes an article titled with a shy title, the title that means nothing, but the article means. The title is Toward the Global Realignment. I strongly suggest you to digit Brzezinski. It's difficult to write. Not for you. For an Italian, it's very difficult. Probably Anyway, Brzezinski Zbigniew is a Polish. He's of Polish origin, and in this article he says, you know, Daesh is not an exception. This is the beginning of a process that will spread everywhere in the world. Because we are facing, Brzezinski is speaking, not me, we are facing the showdown of 500 years of white colonization of the world. And actually, he says, during those 500 years that we, white people, tend generally to forget, in those years, the massacres, the genocide, the violence have not been have been comparable to the history of Nazism in the 20th century. And Brzezinski, at the end of his article, Brzezinski says, unfortunately, we, the Western people, we tend to forget what we have done to the peoples, to the non-white peoples of the world. I was really astonished when I read this text. I did not know that Brzezinski, before dying, was ready to admit something that is not really part of the vision of the leading class of the United States. Probably the understanding that Donald Trump was coming has pushed him to tell the truth at last. But I want to add some words to this, to the Brzezinski declaration. I want to say that we are unable, we the Europeans, for instance, we are unable to pay the debt, the moral debt that we have in front of those populations that we have exploited, that we have destroyed, that we have humiliated, submitted, and at the end we have pushed into the hell of the war. We are unable to pay this moral debt, this concrete debt, because we have to pay an abstract debt to the European Central Bank, to the International Monetary Fund, to the Deutsche Bank, and so on and so on. Well, the point is that the victory of Donald Trump and of a long list of criminals who are the new leaders in Moscow, like in Warsaw, like in London, like in Washington, like probably in Paris in some months, those people are transforming the rage, the frustration of millions of workers into I call it national workerism. It's a comeback of National Socialism in a new version, which is absolutely similar to the past. I know it's not so polite to speak about this, and I know that the press and good people are trying to say, oh, no, don't worry. I mean, yes, Donald Trump has said that he wants to deport millions of migrants. Yes, it's true. Yeah, it's true that he has said that he wants to withdraw the presence of the United States, for instance, from the defense of Japan and South Korea, which means that Japan and South Korea in this moment are working to prepare the bomb. It's unavoidable. It's true that Donald Trump said in an interview that it's obvious that Tehran is producing the bomb in 10 years. Every country will have a nuclear bomb. It's true that he said that, but you know, these are words that one says during an electoral campaign. Read the books of Isaac Bashevis Singer, just to name a writer, and you discover that the Jewish community in Berlin has repeated 1,000 times until the year 41. But yes, Adolf Hitler is speaking big words, he is crazy, but he will never do what he says. What happens next, we know. Well, I am sorry to tell you that my opinion is that now there is no way out. Barack Obama has tried to find a way out, and he came to the fore. You remember that. He came to the fore saying 3 strange words. Yes, we can. And listening to him, I said, oh, come on, you are the most powerful man of the most powerful country ever. How do you say, why do you say, yes, we can? It's obvious, it's part of your job, being powerful. The problem is that Obama is more intelligent than me, and he knew what he is doing, telling those 3 words. He was saying exactly the words that the American people wanted to listen from their president. He was saying, we can do something, because he knew that we can do nothing. He could not close Guantanamo. He could not rein in on Wall Street. He could not stop the war in Afghanistan. He could not stop the war in Iraq. He could not even do a real reform of the health system, because the reform that he did is not a real reform, and anyway, it's going to be cancelled in 2 months. He could not stop the daily killing of Afro-American citizens in the United States. He could not stop the daily sale of weapons to every crazy person in the United States. That is the truth. He could do nothing. So what happens next? Well, of course, we should understand why impotence has become the defining feature of our time. I have an answer, complicated and would take too much time, but I try to be short. First of all, the problem of political potency is strongly linked to our ability to know what happens, to decipher, elaborate, and control information. You remember the 15th chapter of The Prince of Niccolò Machiavelli, of course you remember. He says that the prince, which in his metaphors means power, The prince is essentially someone who is able to submit Fortuna, which of course is a female, and is able to reduce the caprice. Fortuna is capricious, unpredictable. It's the infinite difference of the world. Power, according to Machiavelli, is the ability to reduce the infinite complexities of the chaotic reality to the political will. Well, the problem is that this kind of control has been possible for 500 years, because the relation between knowledge and information was a finite relation. Power was essentially based on the ability of reducing the flows of information. In 1972, in Frankfurt, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas met the philosopher Niklas Luhmann, two interesting guys, you know, and the subject of their discussion was information and democracy, and the subject was obviously new technologies, 72, so they were thinking to the coming informatics, computing science, and so on. What happens to democracy when information starts to become more and more and more speed, fast, and thick? The answer of the good, enlightened, leftist philosopher Jürgen Habermas was kind of obvious. Oh yes, the more people are informed, the more they can decide, so democracy will improve in the age of spreading information. Niklas Luhmann, who was probably less generous and leftist, but in my opinion more far-seeing, said, well, I'm not sure of that. I think that when information becomes too thick and fast, we become unable to know enough to decide. And what happens when the speed of the information flow becomes too much for our ability to decipher and understand and decide? What happens at that point? Luhmann speaks of a sort of displacement of power from the field of politics to the field of administration. I go short, so you forgive my simplification. Well, the point is there. The point is that in the last decades, in the decades of the net, of the growing speed of information, we have created techno-linguistic automatisms that are replacing, that have replaced our will, our potency, our possibility to know and to decide. So, financial capitalism is essentially based on the force of the system of techno-linguistic automatisms that make impossible any democratic decision of the people. We have the proofs everywhere, particularly we have had a proof in the month of July 2015 when the Greek people, 62% of the Greek people take a democratic decision, but the next week Alexis Tsipras is obliged to go to Brussels and to say, I'm sorry, I forget about the referendum, I forget about democracy. Do you want my jacket too? And he threw his jacket on the table, but at the end, he has paid. Go to Athens now. They are paying the debt, and they are dying. That is the point in which we are at this moment. And from this point, what I see as the future of Europe is something that you probably already know. because the blueprint for Europe is Yugoslavia 92-99. That is my dark prediction nowadays. So what for did I come here to? I see your faces are not happy, and I understand. Is it my fault? Yes, it's my fault. But I take back my book because this is a message in the bottom. And this book, in a sense, is trying not only to see the past, but also to see the distant future. I find my talk a little bit laughable, ridicule, because it seems like if I want to convince you of something. I'm not trying to persuade you of nothing, believe me. I don't want to persuade you that my dark prediction will become true, and I don't want to persuade you that in my book there is something that can be useful tomorrow. But the message in the bottle is essentially dedicated to the second generation from now. I think that the next decade will be so horrible that that I don't want to talk about that. I mean, we should be able to see things as they are. It's totally useless to try to find a dialectical way out. It's not a dialectic problem. It's the force of irreversibility. It's the force of inevitability. And as a materialist, I have to speak out what I see. But you know, inside the machine that we cognitive workers of the world have created, have produced, have programmed, inside the machine lies a possibility. The possibility that I said before, the possibility of emancipating ourselves from mental slavery. This is Bob Marley. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but yourself can free your mind. Emancipation from mental slavery. That is the point. Emancipation from the slavery of the superstition. Emancipation from the slavery of the connection, of the mandatory connection between survival and exploitation. We don't need any more to accept this superstition. We don't need any more to undergo this obligation. And emancipating our time means getting free from the psychosis of fascism and from the psychosis of war. Now it's impossible because les jeux sont faits, because it's already done. We have already lost. I will not see the end of this hell, but you will see. And you are smiling, and I am happy of seeing someone who smiles in this crowd, because you can. I mean, those who are now obliged to accept the blackmail of precarious slavery, those who are obliged to go to an educational system, into a university that is totally submitted to profit, competition, aggressiveness, and meritocracy. Those who are obliged to accept the conformism of the neoliberal lies, and tomorrow will be obliged to accept the violence of financial capitalism and fascism, note that the American markets are very well reacting to the national, to the victory of Trump. I read today that NASDAQ is going beyond 19,000, which seems to be an extreme triumph of the markets, but also Adolf Hitler promised to destroy the financial power. Then he became the tool of Krupp and so on. Well, the next generation, the generation that is starting now to think to the future, and who sees no future, because there is no future actually at the moment, that generation has the potency, the possibility of developing something that my generation has been unable to. This is why I say that this book is essentially a message in the bottom. This is why I say that I don't have hope, but I see hope, because hope is in the connective and conjoined and collective solidarity of the international cognitive workers of the world. Thank you very much.